I never imagined that a ruling I issued with full conviction would become my worst mistake and an indelible stain on my career. I am Kendra Jackson, a judge in Detroit, 59 years old, and today I will tell you how justice can fail even in expert hands, and how that truth, when it arrived late, changed everything for me. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It all started with a case that seemed clear. A man accused of a serious crime, evidence against him that, in my opinion, was enough to deliver a fair sentence. I judged, reviewed every detail, listened to all parties, and firmly knew what the verdict was. The law was applied, the ruling was issued. It seemed right. But justice is not just the law, and that is where I was wrong. In the courtroom, the accused, Mark, looked serious, worried, but showed nothing more than that. His lawyer defended every point, but the evidence seemed solid. I did my job, believing I had made the right call. I signed the sentence, trusting it was the best for the community and the judicial system. But then, months later, new evidence emerged. Not just any evidence, but those that could reverse everything. Unpublished documents, testimonies that no one had considered, and evidence that honestly should have been in court from the start. It was like a bomb. In an instant, the whole picture changed and my ruling, which I thought was just, began to crumble. How could I have failed like that? What had happened to the system that didn't catch that before? The law was applied to the letter, but justice, the real justice, had slipped away. It wasn't just a blow for that man, it was also for me as a judge. The confidence in my judgment wavered, and every file I review now reminds me of that even those entrusted to dispense justice can make irreversible mistakes. And you can't imagine the pressure I felt. I couldn't simply take it back, the damage was already done, and reversing that sentence was much more complicated than I thought. I faced questioning, criticism, and doubts that still weigh on me today. Over these years, I've learned that there is no perfect ruling and that the system, although designed to be fair, has its cracks. But also that the commitment to the truth must be constant, even if facing those mistakes hurts. If you've ever thought that justice is absolute and flawless, this story will make you see it differently. I believed I could control everything from my seat in the courtroom, but reality taught me a harsh and necessary lesson. Now, every time I enter the courtroom, I listen differently to the parties. I look beyond the evidence, question more, because I know an unjust ruling doesn't just ruin lives, it also destroys faith in the whole system. And although that sentence was my most painful blow, it also made me a better judge. A more cautious one, more human and aware that justice is a complex path that demands humility. So tell me, have you ever believed that someone in power could make an irreversible mistake? Let me know in the comments. I want to know what you think about this case and if you believe the system can improve. Because in the end, it's not just my story, it's a reminder for everyone. Justice is not an exact science and time can reveal things no one saw coming. That sometimes is the most painful truth a judge can face. I only want the content of the text translated, without any explanation or indication. I remember that day with a clarity that feels painful, almost sharp in my memory. It was a case like many others, a man accused of aggravated robbery, with seemingly solid evidence, witnesses who claimed to have seen him fleeing the scene, and a checkered past that seemed to confirm my suspicions. I judged according to the law, trusting every document, every testimony presented before me. The courtroom was filled with expectant faces, tense lawyers, silent family members, and me, in the position I had always believed unbreakable, the one who not only handed down sentences but justice. I signed the conviction with the calm that years of experience had given me. I had no reason to doubt. But weeks later, life struck me with a truth that appeared when I least expected it. An error, not human, but of the system itself. A forgotten security camera video, recorded a few crucial hours before the alleged crime, showed the accused in a completely different place. Not only that, it revealed definitive proof of his innocence. I felt devastated, as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly opened. It was the beginning of an internal storm no one in the court could perceive, but that dragged me relentlessly. Every morning I woke up with the same question: How could I have been so wrong? It's not just a matter of applying the law, but seeking the truth beyond appearances. This experience marked me, and not only professionally. I engaged in a torturous self-dialogue that no legal reading could resolve. To what extent are judges human? How much weight do our decisions carry when we trust a system that, in the end, can fail? I tried to make amends for that sentence. I conducted investigations on my own, reviewed protocols, contacted experts in digital evidence, asked for similar cases to be reviewed. But the damage was already done. The conviction left irreversible consequences for that man and his family. Justice, on that occasion, was not properly served, and the cost was high. As the case became a delicate topic within the court, I began to notice looks I couldn't decipher. Some were understanding, others potential judges. The error had become a stain that seemed to spread like ink over my career. Hallway conversations grew tense, and although no colleague told me openly, the perception changed. That's when I realized that, for many, the image of the correct and infallible judge was beginning to falter. What hurt me the most was not the tacit criticism nor the external circumstances, but the internal questioning that haunted me. Could my future decisions also be marked by this error? Would I be able to regain confidence in myself? The answer was not simple, but I knew I had to continue, that my duty was not to give up or hide that painful lesson, but to learn from it. Aware of the magnitude of what had happened, I began to study more deeply the technological advances applied in justice, especially in the collection and verification of evidence. We needed to ensure, as a system, that such a failure would not happen again. I created a small working group within the court, made up of judges, lawyers, technicians, and forensic analysts, with the clear intention of expanding access to digital means and cross-referencing data more accurately. It was a slow process, marked by resistance and adjustments, but indispensable to avoid repeating mistakes. However, on a personal level, the torment remained. On my days off, the image of that wrongly convicted innocent man haunted me. His face, his family, his words when I learned the truth, all mixed in my conscience. I wondered if there was anything more I could do to repair that injustice beyond correcting the file. Would it be possible to give him a new chance, or at least help him regain something he had lost? Weeks turned into months, and the case remained alive in my mind. Just as I was beginning to find some peace, an unexpected turn complicated even further what already seemed a difficult ending. I received an anonymous call from someone claiming to have key information about another mistake related to my sentence. I hesitated to take it, knowing it could open even deeper wounds or perhaps lead me to a revealing discovery. Despite initial skepticism, I decided to listen. We agreed to meet in a discreet cafe, and there they handed me documents and details that not only confirmed the man's innocence, but pointed to signs of an illegal operation that had been covered up, and which was one of the reasons why the evidence in court appeared so conclusively convincing. It was a much more complex scheme, involving corruption, manipulation of evidence, and dark objectives, all behind the facade of a fair process. This revelation left me speechless. Everything I thought I knew about that case and about the judicial system was shaken. I realized the magnitude of the struggle before me and the responsibility that went beyond the simple function of judging. Now I had to decide whether to denounce it, confront those networks, or resign myself to being just another piece in a faulty mechanism. I felt broken, exposed, and vulnerable, but also determined. Because I could not, and would not, abandon the search for true justice, nor allow such serious errors to go unpunished. I knew this battle would not be easy, that it could put my career, my safety, even my reputation at risk. But I also understood that nothing was worth more than the integrity with which I had sworn to serve. That night, before going to sleep, I reviewed once again every step that had led me to that painful ruling, trying to understand exactly where the truth was lost. The answer was neither single nor simple. There were small failures, decisions that seemed insignificant, unintentional omissions, and vulnerable systems. But at the heart of it all was the human condition, as fragile as trust itself. I woke up with the firm conviction that this experience would not be a chapter to erase, but a drive to reform. Since then, every file that reaches my desk reminds me that I cannot and must not blindly trust what seems obvious. that justice is a delicate balance between the letter of the law and the tireless pursuit of the truth. That even the most experienced judges can make mistakes, but what defines a true servant of the law is how they face those errors and what they learn from them. The truth arrived late, yes, but that does not mean it can never arrive. That is the message I carry with me and try to convey to those who, like me, find injustice not only a profession, but an imperfect and vital mission. Because in those imperfections lies the humanity that drives us to keep fighting, despite the wounds and stumbles. And now, as I tell you this, my friend, I wonder if you too have ever felt the weight of a half-truth, or the bitter certainty that sometimes, even when we want to do what's right, justice can fail. But I also invite you not to give up, not to lose faith that, with humility and dedication, we can correct, learn, and always seek for truth and justice to walk together. Because that is the only way we can move forward, so that every sentence, every decision, is a step toward a fairer world. And that, believe me, is a legacy worth building, even at the cost of the deepest wounds. Since that meeting at the cafe, everything changed in a way I could never have foreseen. Those documents they handed me, blurry images and coded messages, were not just simple evidence. They were the tip of a much larger and darker iceberg. I was facing a reality that threatened to topple not only a wrongful verdict, but everything I considered the foundation of my career and the entire judicial system. I began to feel that, in my personal quest for justice, I had come up against a monster that preferred to remain hidden. Days passed, and the pressure grew. I found myself trapped between the obligation to fulfill my duty as a judge and the growing fear of what I might discover if I chose to go further. Many tell me justice is blind, but no one had ever told me that sometimes blindness is intentional, disguised behind official papers and infallible procedures. The more I investigated, the clearer the evidence that this illegal operation had tentacles in different areas, from the police to certain forensic laboratories, and even figures with influence within the court itself. I remember a gray afternoon, that typical Detroit day that seems to echo even in your thoughts, when I was reviewing the files they had given me in my office. I was alone, the court silent until the next day of hearings, and fatigue was starting to take its toll. That was when I understood that I couldn't do it alone. I knew I needed allies, people I could trust, because doubting everything and everyone would get me nowhere except worse loneliness and vulnerability. So I made the hardest decision and, despite the anxiety consuming me, I contacted an old colleague, Elizabeth, a human rights lawyer with an impeccable reputation and nerves of steel. I told her in detail what I had discovered, and together we devised a cautious plan to gather more evidence, to build a solid defense not only to correct my ruling, but to expose the entire corrupt network that had made it possible. Elizabeth understood the weight of the fight and without hesitation assured me that we were not alone in this. The next step was to approach that family, the one that had suffered devastation and humiliation, a man imprisoned when he shouldn't even have been on trial. It was not an easy reception. Distrust and pain were still very alive, and that very fact made our commitment more urgent. We promised them we would do everything possible, that the justice once denied to them would not be just an empty promise. I felt profoundly and almost physically at that moment that justice was not just dead letter. It was a fragile but necessary ideal that must be protected with every effort, and that any deviation exacted a brutal price in human lives. With that renewed determination, the following weeks were filled with secret meetings, endless analyses, and sleepless nights. Amid that whirlwind, another problem began to emerge: external pressure. It didn't take long before the situation caught the attention of those who preferred silence. I received anonymous messages, calls at strange hours, and the constant feeling of being watched. There were moments when I doubted my decision, when fatigue and the weight of fear made me question whether it was worth risking so much, not just my career, but also my physical integrity and the safety of those who supported me. But in those dark moments, I thought of the wrongly convicted man, his shattered family, and all those who could suffer similar injustices. It was that thought that sustained me when my body begged for rest and my soul begged to give up. I found strength in the conviction that the truth, even if late, must come to light. that the system could not continue functioning as it had until then, blind to manipulations and a victim of its own cracks. So we moved forward. Every new piece of data, every testimony we managed to secure beyond the reach of those wanting to bury the truth, was a blow to the corrupt network, but also a reminder of how deep and tangled the problem was. From that secret cat in the forgotten security camera, everything that seemed solid began to crumble, revealing a web that involved not only the falsification or manipulation of evidence, but economic and political interests, making our work even more delicate and dangerous. At one of the tensest moments, one of the key sources we had managed to contact disappeared without a trace. It was a direct hit to the heart of our team and a clear message to stop the investigation. That disappearance not only confirmed the real risk we faced, but also the level of corruption and violence surrounding the case. My nights ceased to be peaceful and every shadow in the hallways seemed a threat. But it also reinforced my commitment. It reminded me that I could not give in, because something much bigger was at stake, the very existence of trust and justice. As we cautiously advanced, documenting every finding, we also had to face the system's limitations. Bureaucracies that slowed down investigations, colleagues who preferred to look the other way, institutions that showed more interest in saving reputations than solving problems. I understood that change would not be immediate or easy, and that sometimes the system seemed to fight against itself. Still, amid that resistance, I also found fellow judicial professionals willing to join our cause, to risk a little so that this injustice would stop spreading its shadow. The path revealed the darkest side of justice, but also its most hopeful light. In conversations with young judges and lawyers, I heard words of recognition. I understood that some also felt, as I did, the urgent need for reforms and to protect the truth beyond formalities. That gave me a quiet hope that, no matter the outcome of our fight in this case, the seed of transformation was already planted. And although the price seemed high, I knew it was a necessary path. As we progressed, the name of the man wrongly convicted began to circulate beyond the judicial halls and reached local communities. The family received support from organizations fighting injustice, and little by little, the story I had lived firsthand began to raise awareness so it would not happen to anyone else. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, reminding me that behind the files there are real people with stories worthy of all our attention and effort. That night, as the sun barely peeked through the windows of my office, I reflected on all that had happened. I remembered that justice is not an abstract concept, but the sum of daily commitment, of decisions made with honesty even in uncertainty, and of the humility to recognize mistakes and correct them. That is why this experience did not defeat me, it strengthened me. It taught me that the truth can always arrive despite time and obstacles, and that it is in that process that the true value of our work is revealed. However, although the storm seemed to be easing, I sensed that the hardest part was still ahead, confronting those who had caused the corruption, unmasking the responsible so they answer before the law, and ensuring that justice mechanisms were reformed to prevent new irreparable failures. I knew that would be a rocky road that would test my strength as a jurist and as a person. That is why now more than ever I remain alert, aware of the price that truth can exact, but with the firm determination not to let fear silence my voice. Because what I learned from this bitter experience is that, although justice can fail, there is always the opportunity to rebuild it, step by step, with courage and with the certainty that our humanity, with its imperfections, is also the engine that can drive transformation. And to you, who listen to these words, I leave this reflection. Justice is not a straight or perfect path. It is a constant battle between law and truth, between humanity and its mistakes. But that battle is what defines us, what tests our convictions and commitment to human dignity. No matter how many times the truth arrives late, what matters is that it can always arrive, because in that lies the very hope of living in a world where justice is more than an ideal. It is a reality within your reach and mine. Thus, this story continues, not as an end, but as a call to awaken, to question, to fight without stepping back. Because only by facing our shadows and mistakes can we build the necessary light so that the law is not just a set of rules, but a true embrace of justice. And that, my friend, is the legacy that, with wounds and decisions, I am determined to leave. It took longer than I would have liked to admit before we could take the next concrete step. Prudence was necessary, but it was also the fiercest enemy when the truth takes time to find its way. I found myself increasingly overwhelmed, trapped in a sea of papers, encrypted emails, hidden audios, and whispered testimonies, where every clue that seemed to lead us forward opened the door to an even more complex labyrinth. It was exhausting, a silent and relentless struggle, yet that spark of justice remained lit, though barely perceptible at times. Elizabeth and I decided that to dismantle the network that had infiltrated the very core of the system, we had to attack from the most unexpected place, the system itself. Don't get me wrong, I knew how risky it was to bet against bureaucracy and rigid structures, but I understood that sometimes the rules must become flexible to defend the justice they were created to guarantee. We began by identifying the officials who, unknowingly, had been manipulated pieces in this corrupt machinery. It was not only about visible culprits, but also those who preferred to look the other way out of fear or comfort. Our strategy could not be limited to tangible evidence. It had to expose the climate of complicity that permeated every corner. That's why one of the first things we did was turn to the young judges and lawyers who shared our aspiration. I met with them in small groups in discreet places where noise and inquisitive eyes wouldn't reach us. There, without formalities or protocol, I told them the truth behind the erroneous sentence, the network woven in silence, and the real danger we were facing. I felt a mixture of respect and hope as I saw that, far from being intimidated, they responded with incisive questions and a desire for action. It was that collective energy that propelled me forward, reminding me that despite the flaws, justice was alive in the drive of every committed person. But, of course, not everything was progress or support. The pressure we felt became more tangible and personal. One morning, while reviewing documents at home, I found an envelope without a sender containing photos of my children in their daily activities. It was a low blow that shook me deeply because not only was my job at stake, but now my family's safety directly as well. I understood that the corrupt network was willing to go all the way to stop us. The question was no longer whether we should stop, but how we could protect ourselves and continue. I thought again about the condemned man. His life had been destroyed by noise that should never have existed and by a system that failed to listen to him. That injustice that labeled and imprisoned him now resonated in my mind with growing intensity, pushing me to move forward like never before. I could not allow a story to end as a forgotten file or a quiet exit without consequences. The path was dangerous, yes, but also necessary. Elizabeth found a new lead in the financial profiles of some of those involved, uncovering suspicious transfers between different institutions and external contractors. It was an economic web pointing not only to judicial or police corruption, but to a true systemic fraud, with ramifications that could reach very high political spheres. That revelation made me understand that we were delving into deeper territory than we had initially imagined, where the boundaries between legal and illegal were blurry, deliberately drawn to protect the powerful. That week, however, despite the threats and exhaustion, we achieved a small victory. After meetings with community defenders and non-governmental organizations, we managed to activate a mechanism to review the file of the condemned man. It was not the definitive solution, not yet, but it was a slightly open door, the opportunity for a thorough and impartial review to take place. When I received the news, I felt relief that I did not allow myself to show immediately. Behind that feeling was also the awareness that this was only the beginning of a process that would surely be long and full of obstacles. A few weeks later, in the midst of the storm, I received an unexpected message. It was from someone who had been watching from the shadows, an internal informant who, tired of the dark paths, decided to risk everything to provide irrefutable evidence. Bound by a confidentiality pact that neither Elizabeth nor I could ignore, they revealed documents showing clearly how hundreds of pieces of evidence had been meticulously tampered with and how some sentences were issued not based on truth but under specific interests. The magnitude of the damage was horrendous and, at the same time, decisive for our struggle. However, not everything in this story was cold, numbers, and papers. During those months, amid tensions and constant surveillance, there were moments of humanity that reconnected me with why I had decided to become a judge in the first place. I received anonymous letters from grateful people, some beyond the family of the condemned man, individuals who had felt the weight of unjust sentences or simply the system's troubles. I read each word several times, and more than once, tears prevented me from finishing the reading. Those small, silent gestures were like a balm that balanced the harshness of the fight. But reality hit hard when I noticed the cracks in my personal relationships. The distance the investigation generated with friends and even some colleagues was palpable. Some wanted to protect me, others looked at me with suspicion, and a few saw me as a risk or a problem rather than an agent of change. That new loneliness that accompanied me added to the weight of responsibility and threats. There were nights when the silence was so deep it seemed to deafen me as I reviewed the list of risks and possibilities. Exhaustion was stronger, but conviction remained intact. One dawn, when the city was asleep, we received another unexpected blow. The digital file where we had stored most of the evidence disappeared. It was not an accident, clearly. Someone deep inside was ready to erase traces and hinder progress. It was a moment of tremendous despair, more for the feeling of vulnerability than for the material loss. However, that also showed the scale of the force we had against us and at the same time strengthened the need to solidify our support network to protect the data and the people. Under those circumstances, Elizabeth proposed something that at first made me hesitate but became fundamental: radical transparency as a tool. We decided to share carefully selected fragments with trusted journalists, independent media that could not be co-opted by those corrupt interests. It was a risk, opening the investigation to public scrutiny, but after months in the dark, we understood that the sun could be the best antidote against corruption that feeds on shadows. That action set in motion a wave of social and political pressure that quickly made itself felt. It was the moment when our story stopped being just a frightened secret and became a collective outcry. But not everything was celebration. With visibility came new reprisals. Some friends stopped talking to me, unknown vehicles began following me leaving the courthouse, and a strange feeling of being watched became my constant companion. It was painful because it not only put those close to me at risk, but also confronted me with the hardest question: how far was I willing to go? But the thought of the condemned man and his family, and the awareness that more people were being harmed every day, denied me the option of stopping. It was a deeply personal commitment that transcended any fear. One morning, while reviewing a folder with new evidence, I realized that we had achieved more than dismantling a network of corruption. We had created a community of struggle, a spark beginning to ignite others. Some young judges dared to question decisions, some hearings were no longer handled with the opacity of before, and the voices of affected families began to resonate more strongly. For the first time in a long time, I felt that justice could truly be reborn, not through cold law, but through human and collective commitment. I don't want to lie or adorn the story with superficial triumphs, because disappointments, setbacks, and the bitter certainty that there is still a long way to go also came. There are wounds that do not heal easily and systems that have memory to protect their old habits. But that night, looking Elizabeth in the eyes, I understood that what we had lived was a fundamental chapter so that in the future, others could avoid the traps that almost sank us. Strength lies in perseverance, in not giving up when the battle seems lost, and in holding on to the truth even when it arrives late. In the end, I understood that this story is not just about correcting an unjust sentence, but about pointing out that justice is human, imperfect, complex, and therefore needs brave guardians who are not afraid to confront their own shadows to bring light. The essential thing is not the speed with which the truth appears, but that we never, not even for a moment, stop seeking and defending it. Because in that battle, no matter how hard it is, lies the very hope of a fairer, more dignified, and more humane world. And so, as I close these lines, with my gaze fixed on a future I still do not see clearly, I know I am not alone, and perhaps I never was. This story remains alive, and that is the greatest victory I can share. Because justice, with its falls and resurgences, is the story of all of us, and there is no greater act of courage than not staying silent, not letting fear stop you, and fighting, always fighting for it. The days that followed seemed to stretch out in a mix of contained anxiety and a kind of tense resignation. Something in the air had changed. It was no longer just a matter of documents, reports, or legal procedures. We had set in motion a force that, although difficult to fully control, was unstoppable. But the feeling that the ground was becoming more unstable beneath our feet accompanied us every step of the way. Each advance awakened unexpected reactions, hidden conspiracies, and maneuvers to discredit or silence us. The corruption we had exposed was not simple. It was a living organism, fueled by fear, power, and silence. I remember one particularly difficult afternoon when, after a marathon of meetings with various sectors, I received a direct call that made my whole body tense up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost monotone, but with a lethal undertone. "Your time for games is over, Judge. Step back before the next blows are irreparable." It was a clear, straightforward threat. For a moment, I felt the world shrink and the responsibility weigh heavier than ever, not only on my shoulders, but on everyone I had involved in this fight. Elizabeth was by my side, and together we knew this could not be a breaking point, but rather a push to strengthen our resolve. We could not back down now. One of the most complex things about all this was learning to live in a precarious balance between caution and courage. It was necessary to safeguard information, protect those who trusted us, and at the same time not abandon the transparency we had promised. Every document we published, every call to higher authorities, was an act of faith, but also a calculated risk. The night became a time to plan, to work under the light of a solitary lamp while the city rested. Despite the exhaustion and constant unease, those hours were also a refuge, a moment when the outside noise faded and only the clarity of purpose remained. But as the fire of our fight seemed to grow, the system began to show its harshest limbs. Just when everything indicated that the review of the convicted man's file might take a favorable turn, unforeseen obstacles emerged. An auditorium full of officials reluctant to accept pressure, speeches calculated to sow doubt about our integrity, and even attempts to discredit the source of our evidence. It was as if the real trial was not in the courtroom, but in the hidden corridors where power is maneuvered without witnesses. We saw how the truth, even when backed by compelling facts, could be questioned, twisted, or ignored to maintain the status quo. The battle for the review took on a more intense public character. The media began to join in with questions, interviews, and increasing coverage, which opened up a broader debate about justice in our city. It was a double-edged sword. Social pressure created essential support, but also magnified our vulnerability. One morning, upon arriving at my office, I found an envelope with newspaper clippings and messages manipulating our story, labeling us as agitators or a threat to order. That campaign designed to wear down credibility sought to undermine not only the investigation, but the very notion of justice we were defending. Still, the community we had begun to form became our greatest support. Among the young judges and lawyers who accompanied us, movements emerged pushing for transparency and change. Some of them, facing their own fears and internal pressure, began to report irregularities, request case reviews, and create spaces for dialogue on ethics within the judicial system. It was a silent rebirth, an epidemic of questioning with no turning back. Elizabeth and I realized that although we had sparked the flame, the fire was beginning to spread on its own in diverse hearts and minds. But the reprisals also took more direct and personal forms. It was not long before daily surveillance intensified to the point of obsession. At every step, I felt invisible eyes, and there was no longer a private space where I truly felt safe. One day, when I went to visit my children at school, I noticed a suspicious vehicle parked nearby, and I suspected it was no coincidence. The concern for their safety filled me with a mixture of sadness and anger I had never experienced so intensely before. Understanding that our commitment to justice affected those I loved most made me question every decision, but it also strengthened my conviction that stopping would mean betraying not only them but everyone who trusted in a system that should protect us. Involving them in this fight entailed risks, and on several occasions, Elizabeth and I had long conversations about the limits of our exposure. How much personal power was fair to sacrifice? Where was the line between bravery and recklessness? Every answer seemed different because this was not a conventional battle, but one where the rules changed with every move and every revelation. We found a delicate balance by relying on mutual trust, security protocols, and the certainty that our work was worth more than individual fears. Because lives were at stake, and they were not just numbers and files. There was an episode that marked a before and after. One day, when exhaustion seemed to have taken full control, Elizabeth arrived with a shocking discovery. A hidden archive in a government database documenting secret meetings between judicial officials and representatives of companies benefiting from illegal contracts. It was irrefutable proof not only of the corruption surrounding the wrongful sentence, but of a much wider network using justice as a facade for illicit enrichment. The magnitude of that information made us reassess our strategy. That investigation could not and should not be limited to isolated cases, because what we had before us was the face of a sick system. The decision was to bet on the systematic and careful dissemination of that evidence, always protecting sources and without exposing vulnerable individuals. We convened a small group of brave journalists, and through them, the denunciations began to reach national audiences and agencies. The impact was immediate. Policies began to be reviewed, prosecutors called additional hearings, and political attention increased. For the first time, I felt that perhaps, after years of frustrations, our fight had a real chance to transform something beyond one person, one sentence. It was collective justice checkmating the interests that wanted to corrupt it. But it was also the moment when the pressure reached its most dangerous point. In the following weeks, attacks became more aggressive and evident. There were attempts to hack our systems, false leaks aimed at damaging the image of the convicted man and his defense, and the constant feeling of being in danger. The line between public and private life disappeared completely. Every night, before sleeping, I mentally reviewed a plan to protect my children, Elizabeth, and my colleagues who dared to support us. The fight had become an existential matter where every mistake could be fatal not only for our cause, but for our physical and mental integrity. In that climate, I also had to face the worst kind of doubt, the internal one. There were moments when guilt overwhelmed me, thinking about how a judicial decision I believed was right had unleashed all that chaos and suffering. I wondered if the weight of my error was too great to bear and if I was leading other people to a precipice. But then a memory, a word, a story of someone who found hope upon seeing the truth come to light would arrive, and that image was such a sweet burden that I could carry it to the end. It was not about seeking personal redemption, but about paying a debt to justice and humanity. The review of the convicted man's case was finally scheduled after months of delay and resistance. In that hearing, which seemed small but was actually a monumental act, I witnessed manipulated evidence being dismantled, testimonies questioned, and windows opened to a reality the system had tried to keep hidden. It was a cathartic moment, both for him and for those of us behind the scenes. I exchanged glances with Elizabeth and knew that no fight, no threat, had been in vain. However, the path was not yet over. That review was merely a sign that justice could indeed be corrected, but the fight for truth was ongoing. In those days, while everything seemed to rage around us, I found strength in small details that seemed insignificant but were central to me. A coffee shared with a young judge expressing his gratitude for the opportunity to question a rigid system. A sincere hug from a mother who had seen her son fall to an unjust sentence. An unexpected gesture of support from a colleague who until then had stayed on the sidelines. Those moments reminded me that behind the files and processes there were real lives, stories of pain and hope that deserved more than just a ruling and a filing date. I also learned that the truth, although late, had transformative power. Sometimes it's not the speed with which it appears, but the depth with which it sinks into people. That a judicial error is not just a stain on a judge's history, but an urgent call for critical review, humility, and permanent commitment. That in vulnerability lies the greatest strength to rise and change, and that true justice is that which acknowledges its flaws in order to grow and protect those who depend on it. I remember a rainy night, looking out the window of my office, thinking about all we had gone through. It was not just a fight for a case or a sentence. It was a battle for an ideal that often seemed to fade amid bureaucracy and shadows. But that night, I saw something different. A possible dawn, a light beginning to pierce the darkness. And I felt that no matter how long it would take, or how many obstacles appeared, this was a story of resistance. That in every step taken, even in exhaustion, there was an echo resonating beyond us, a collective force demanding justice with all its imperfections and hope. I don't know what the future will bring, nor which names will remain in history, but I know that the most valuable thing in all this is the courage not to stay silent and the firm will to keep seeking the truth no matter how long it takes to arrive. Because in the end, that search is what defines us, what humanizes us, and what perhaps, little by little, can renew faith in a system we all wish to be just and dignified. And although the most painful sentence of my life happened when the truth came too late, the true victory is not in the final ruling, but in never having stopped fighting for it. Even in the deepest darkness, the atmosphere in the city seemed increasingly heavy, as if the weight of our revelations had awakened an unstoppable storm. Each day brought new challenges, but also a disturbing certainty. We were touching a raw nerve of power, a place where the lines between legality and corruption blurred with dangerous confusion. At times, I felt that we were not just facing a network of hidden interests, but a machine designed to defend itself fiercely, willing to sacrifice anything to preserve its impunity. It was not just a battle of documents or words, it was a silent but brutal confrontation between those yearning for justice and those afraid of losing control. However, there was an unexpected twist that changed everything. Just when the pressure seemed unbreakable, a call arrived that revolutionized the case, a lead Elizabeth discovered after a month of almost desperate searching. It was a recording, a digital file found on the personal computer of an official who had cooperated, perhaps blinded by conscience or tired of keeping secrets. In that file, conversations were heard directly linking high judicial officials with operators of the companies involved in the corruption network. These were not just cryptic messages, but explicit plans to manipulate rulings, pressure judges, and sweep away legal obstacles. Hearing those voices was a sharp, nearly paralyzing blow. The truthfulness of that evidence opened a door we had never imagined, but also multiplied the risk of every step we took. We couldn't step into the light without first preparing a much stronger protection strategy. We worked secretly, isolated, fine-tuning details so that no move would be vulnerable to leaks or sabotage. The faces of those who trusted us appeared more frequently in my mind as a permanent reminder that what we were doing had to be for them, for the memory of justice they deserved. It was then that I realized that beyond the people fleeing in plain sight, the true enemy was a silent network stretched out in the shadows, invisible to the naked eye but lethal in its consequences. That breakthrough unleashed immediate reactions. Weeks passed with the phone ringing nonstop with threats, anonymous calls, and rumors designed to demoralize us or make us give up. Daily life became an arena where every step could be a potential minefield. There came a moment when I doubted whether determination would overcome physical and mental exhaustion, whether the weight of threats would eventually break us. However, amid that darkness, an unexpected ally appeared. A group of young lawyers who, inspired by our fight, began organizing volunteer efforts to advise people in similar situations, tangled in unjust rulings. That solidarity, that fresh energy pushing from below, was a vital breath. Seeing how, despite everything, the desire for justice found resonance in other voices made me persist when the temptation to surrender loomed strongly. But not everything was progress. In a streak of events that seemed torn from a noir novel, a clear attempt to discredit the files and evidence arose out of nowhere. A hired expert appeared declaring that the recordings were manipulations, that the files had technical inconsistencies, and launched a media campaign to sow doubt just when clarity was most needed. It was a cruel and low move because it toyed with the very legitimacy of the process and with the public trust we had been building. The feeling was of a psychological game where any piece we put on the table could be swept away by a simple authoritative blow or a well-planted rumor. Elizabeth and I had to protect not only the investigation, but also our public image. In a terrain where truth and lies mingled with ruthless precision, maintaining credibility was a battle in itself. While all this was happening, the review of the case of the convicted man advanced slowly, like a race against time that never seemed to end. The hearings became confrontation battlegrounds, where every detail was a miniature war to prove the injustice. I remember a particular moment when a key witness who had sworn to always prioritize the truth suddenly changed his version, confusing or distorting facts. That betrayal not only hit us hard, but also exposed how far hidden pressures could go. The experience made me understand that this fight was not just against a corrupt system, but also against the fear of those trapped in its web, people who preferred to remain silent and let lies persist rather than face reprisals that could destroy their lives. It was a gray day, while walking to court, that I found an anonymous letter in my mailbox. Inside, shaky words revealed that one of the officials involved in the plot had decided to cooperate, not out of bravery, but deep remorse. That letter was a door opening, a sign that the truth could indeed break through seemingly impassable barriers. We contacted that informant with the utmost caution, and his testimonies began to give shape to evidence that until then seemed invisible. For the first time in months, I felt that the effort was not in vain, that this fight could bring real change. However, the threat never left. Surveillance increased, and I felt how the risk became just another inhabitant of my daily life. The following weeks were of maximum tension. The judicial review became a public stage where social and media pressure reached a point no one could ignore. We saw colleagues who previously preferred silence rise up and openly support the cause, aware that staying on the sidelines was being part of the problem. The city began to speak of justice with a different voice. Citizens demanded answers, and, although the resistance remained fierce, a crack appeared in the wall of silence. It was then that I understood that the system, no matter how harmful or corrupt, had within it the possibility of restructuring. It didn't matter how long it took or the number of obstacles. The truth, although delayed, was starting to make its way. And then, finally, the day of the most crucial hearing arrived. Sitting in the room, surrounded by tense faces, I listened carefully as the defense dismantled piece by piece the chain of manipulations woven around the case. It was a moment of poetic justice to see how the very law that had been used to condemn without foundation now served to restore the truth and vindicate the innocent. At that moment, I knew something I had sensed from the beginning. Justice is not a straight line or a fixed instant, but a winding path that requires courage, patience, and unwavering commitment. That ruling did not just correct an error, but planted the seed for justice in Detroit to look forward with a little more hope. However, as the final verdict was read aloud, the feeling inside me was complex, full of gratitude but also alertness. I knew that victory was only a stage, a momentary pause in a battle that would not end with a simple verdict. Corruption and injustice don't disappear with a signed paper, and the real fight would be to keep the flame alive so that it never happens again. And there, in that room, surrounded by faces marked by emotion, I understood that justice was not an abstract ideal but a tangible, daily, and painful responsibility each one must assume, even if the truth arrives late and the price is very high. That night, as I closed the door of the courtroom, I felt I was also closing a chapter that had changed me forever. I knew the story would continue unfolding in other cases, other voices, and new struggles, and that my role did not end here. But above all, I understood that the greatest value was in never stopping the search, in not letting despair bury the yearning for justice. Because in that search lies the most human, the most dignified, and also the hope that can still illuminate the deepest darkness. That ruling, painful as it was not the final point, but the beginning of an awakening that still echoes on the streets, in the courts, and in the hearts that refuse to remain silent. And in that delayed truth, I found the strength to move forward, to not give up, and to believe, always believe, in a tomorrow where justice does not come too late.